I've met most of you, but not all of you. And one of the things I love about this Conversations with the Community is that every time I'm going to meet new people among us who care about the things that we care about. My name is Noelle Morissette, and I'm the new Director of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at UNC Greensboro. And I'm very happy to have introductions lined up here for our distinguished speaker of the evening, who many of you know, Dr. Omar Ali, who is the Dean of the Lloyd International Honors College at UNCG. Dr. Ali is a specialist in the global African diaspora, African American political history, Afro-Latin America, Islam and the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean world. And he has several authored books on these subjects. And he has a newly released book, which is called In the Balance of Power, Independent Black Politics and Third-Party Movements in the United States, which is an updated book that now includes chapters on or references to Barack Obama's presidency as well as Donald Trump's. And Omar comes to us, and I think this is important, you know, to kind of have a look at. He comes to us from the London School of Economics and also Columbia University. There's ways that our educations take us both deeper into where we're from, but also put us into the world at large in lots of interesting ways. So welcome, Omar. It's so good to have you to talk about your book tonight.
That's great. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you all for being on this. And I want to thank Dominic Hand for stepping in within the last few hours. He had a few hours notice. And I thought of who could I ask, who could step in and help moderate. And he came to mind immediately. So thank you for doing that. Dominic is actually one of our star graduates of the AADS program. He went on to get his master's degree in sociology here at UNC Greensboro, and is one of the speakers, educators for the Racial Equity Institute. And we were talking a little bit about like, how is that going? And so they're doing it virtually now, but really important work. And actually, I recently was listening to the podcast for 1619, which maybe some of you know about, was a project that came out of the New York Times, and there is a series of articles looking at 1619, which is often seen as sort of the foundational year for African American sort of studies, because that's when the first 20 or so, as it was in the records, Negroes were brought here to what would become North America and United States of America in particular. There were people brought into Florida. And we have figures like Esteban, who was like a Black conquistador. He was working with the conquistadores. But in terms of African Americans, 1619 is usually the date that's talked about. But in the podcast, actually, one of Dominic's colleagues was talked about. And I was so proud to have the Greensboro mentioned, because that's where we're situated. So Greensboro is a very important historical city because of the civil rights movement, but also going back to the abolitionist era and it being the site of the Eastern Seaboard terminus of the Underground Railroad. So where we are, and some of you will recognize the street Friendly, comes from the Society of Friends, which is the formal name of the Quakers. And the Quakers worked with free Black people to help get enslaved Black people out to freedom. So there's a lot of history in our city, and the recent history of refugees and coming from different parts of Africa and other parts of the world. So UNCG is a very important place, and I'm absolutely honored to be on the faculty here and to work with colleagues like Dr. Morissette and having our graduates like Dominic Hand and others who are actively involved in continuing to educate both off campus and on campus by offering their expertise. So thank you for that. I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about the book, and this is what the book is. So here it is. And I'm actually one of those people that buys books by their cover. And so I actually really like this cover. I actually wasn't as huge a fan of the original cover, which is over there. I could reach it, but anyway. But I like this because it shows sort of the faces of various people who've been part of independent Black political movements. And so at the top, you might recognize one person here. Some of you might know her. She was actually the first woman and the first African American to get on the ballot to running for president of the United States. Does anybody know who she is by any chance? It starts with an F. Most people do not know her because she was an independent. Like if you ask the question, who was the first Black woman, to run for president? And people say usually Shirley Chisholm, right? That's a reasonable guess. But she actually ran as a Democrat and she never got the nomination of the Democratic Party. So she didn't get on the ballot, which simply means when your name is where you can go vote for the person. And that's a big deal. Just getting your name on the ballot is very, very difficult in many states. So Dr. Fulani did that in 1988, 20 years before President Obama was elected. She was the first Black person to have gotten on the ballot in all 50 states. And she ran as an independent. And we'll talk a little bit about her, but the book is called In the Balance of Power, Independent Black Politics and Third Party Movements. And it was originally published in 2008. It was literally just on the cusp of President Obama becoming elected. And I identified at that time this Black and independent alliance that came together. For those of you, you might remember, but we're students of history. When President Obama was first campaigning, he was reaching out to all people. Like he wasn't just focused on progressives, if you will. He was focused on Americans. And that was appealing to many people because it was not a Democratic campaign in the sense of it just being a liberal or progressive thing, but it's really an appeal to Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And independents right now make up about 42% of voters. So 42% of people self-identify as politically independent, neither Democrat nor Republican. Now, many of those people register into the Democratic or Republican Party because they want to have some kind of an impact in a real politics sense. Because if you don't, then you can't vote in half of the states because there's closed primaries in half of the states. But more and more Americans are self-identifying as neither Democrat nor Republican. And many of the young people on this call are sort of part of a cohort that's the fastest growing group of people who are choosing to register as unaffiliated. So not just identifying, but also registering as such. So I made the case, I was trying to make the case to the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, which is sort of premier Black political think tank in DC, that there needs to be a decoupling of our understanding of the presidential election of President Obama, that I argue that most people did not vote for him because he was a Democrat, but they were voting because he was Obama. Obama was is a very special elected or a former president, but figure. And so the Democratic Party said, oh, well, here's more support for the Democrats. And he had built his base by reaching out very broad and amassed this sort of very cross ideological, I'm not talking about far right, but people who are maybe socially conservative, but also believed that there needed to be some real changes in America and that it was time, it had been a long time for a Black person to become president of the United States. And so he reached out, but when he got elected, he made, I believe, the mistake of handing over his database to the Democratic Party. And if you look at the history of African Americans and the major parties, whenever leaders do that, they lose their power, actually. And so some of the folks who I worked with, in fact, Jacqueline Saylor is the person who wrote the afterword, was trying to convince them to the Obama campaign to stay independent, even if you're elected on the Democratic ticket, maintain a degree of independence, but don't just give your entire database. And for those of us who've done political organizing, it's all about the database. It's all about the contacts. And so if you give that over, then you kind of lost that. But I think that President Obama, who I personally really admire and love, of course, anybody can critique things of anybody, but generally speaking, I'm a huge fan. I think that he thought that his Obama-ness would be able to kind of not be taken over by the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party is a very powerful machine. And it's, I'm not picking on the Democrats. You know, Malcolm famously said, I'm not, you know, but I want to make it clear that, you know, these two entities, the Democrats and Republicans, are not for basically Black people. And Malcolm arguably was independent. I mean, he didn't run for office, but he was, and he's actually up here, but you know, he was the inspiration for many independent Black organizations and entities. And he comes out of independent Black organizing when you look at the Nation of Islam and sort of the roots and the Garvey roots and all that stuff. There's a tradition of independence. So this evening's presentation, and I'll speak for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, then we can open things up, is to basically look at how Black independents have been history makers in American history. And so the fact is the foundation of the country rests on this gross contradiction of freedom and slavery, language of liberty, but actuality of enslavement of hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, by the time of the Civil War, 4 million people were emancipated, or self-emancipated, but emancipated. But at the time of the Republic, basically 1 in 5 people were enslaved. And the vast majority of people could not participate in electoral politics because you had to have enough wealth, basically, either property or another kind. Interestingly, for a very small window, there were some women and there were some African Americans who did vote. But that window got shut down very, very quickly. And this is something that Dominic could also speak to, because that's what they talk about, some of this colonial history and Revolutionary American War, revolutionary history. So what happened was that there was a very small group of people who participated and were allowed to participate in the body politic. And they used the language of liberty, but it was in contrast to the actuality of many people who were enslaved, but also in other kinds of forms of forced labor, like indentured servitude. So African Americans have, in some ways, have always had to become organized outside of the dominant structures in order to exert power, even as some have gotten in and exerted some power from within. And if there's one thing I think you can come away with from this talk, is that African Americans have always played a sort of 2 roads are better than 1 tactic. 1 foot in the dominant institutions and 1 foot out. If you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, it's not a Democratic Party movement, clearly. It is a movement that was grown out of independent Black organizing, and that it's like one of those Venn diagrams. There's overlap with some of the ideas of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but it's not a Democratic Party movement, nor was the Civil Rights Movement, actually. And so African Americans have had to exert their independence from the very beginning by organizing in as associations, as individuals, as institutions, to exert their power. And ultimately, the exertion of Black power in America has expanded democracy for everybody. So I think that the 2 roads are better than 1, that is, inside-outside tactic, is an important lesson if you're going to take away something from this presentation, and the critical role of African Americans in expanding democracy for everyone. And that means the models of organizing, the politic, the language. One can't meaningfully speak about freedom without understanding its opposite, which is slavery. Orlando Patterson, the great sociologist from Harvard, talked about that. These things are inextricably tied. And so African Americans have been the leaders in pushing for democracy, not exclusively, but have played the key leadership role in my estimation. And that's what's always attracted me to Black political history, is that role of the making of the modern world by Black people. So one can look at history through many different lenses and pull out different sort of ways. Like you could look at American history through, I don't know, food. I'm not being silly here, I'm being serious. You can look at American history through architecture. You can look at it through women. But each of these categories encompass many things. And so when I talk about independent Black politics, it encompasses many different types of things. And I think that there is this thread throughout American history of independent Black political organizing. So what does that mean? In the earliest phases, it meant literally running away, or forming maroon type settlements, that is runaway communities that would exert their independence. And my colleague, the great historian, Sylviane Diouf, wrote American Maroons, which talks about the preponderance of maroon activity in the North, in the US, which has normally not been characterized as such, except for maybe the Black Seminoles or something like that. What mostly runaway slave communities are talked about in the Caribbean and South America, but she's sort of pulled out all the maroon activity, people living on the edges of plantations, for instance, and having relations with people on the plantations, and sort of them coming in and out, and one foot in, one foot out, if you will. And so it begins with sort of slaves resisting slavery, and in some cases, white people or others helping them. In the case of Guilford County here in Greensboro, we're talking about the white Quakers. But African Americans were the ones who were self-liberating, and that's always very important, because the ways in which abolitionist history is talked about is usually sort of the white saviors coming in to help these poor Black people, but that was not the case. It was a partnership, and Black people never needed the language of white Enlightenment thinkers to self-liberate, but they also used that language to advance. So they appropriated some of that language from the earliest days. So it meant running away, independence, and then over time forming organization. And so with sort of the emphasis here on the history that I detail, which is Black political history, we look at organizations like the Liberty Party. So the Liberty Party was perhaps the first, if you will, Black political electoral entity. And it was formed about 1840. You'll recall from some of your history that the abolitionists were basically sort of really launching in the 1830s. This is the second wave of abolitionism. The first wave was to get rid of slavery itself, which is to get rid of this transatlantic slave trade, which happened by 1808. But slavery itself was still alive and kicking, in fact, growing with the expansion of the nation into the West, or what's now the Midwest, but with cotton becoming king, there was an expansion of slavery. And so while the slave trade ended across the Atlantic, and not fully, but it was diminished, there was an increase of trade coming from the Caribbean and also within the United States. So the thing you wouldn't want to do is to be sent west or further south. And that was a trade that was happening. In fact, Levi Coffin, the great white abolitionist here in Guilford County, talked about being very inspired or motivated or shocked, it was actually probably the better word, of seeing a coffle of slaves as a child going by, and him asking his father, what is this? And these men are tied up in chains, what is this? And him being sort of shocked by what it was. And that was an inspiration for him to kind of do whatever he could to help liberate Black people. But the role of free Black people is critical. So Sol, S-O-L, was one of the key organizers of the Underground Railroad alongside Levi Coffin, and we have documentation. In fact, UNCG's Jackson Library has basically a database of runaway slave ads, which is utterly fascinating. And I actually found in it a really interesting instance of a runaway named Ireland. And I suspect that he was a white Irish, probably indentured servant, who was essentially de facto a slave, and was advertised as a runaway. And there's this history of white indentured servants and Black indentured servants and slaves working together. And so I'm currently teaching a course called Race, Philosophy, Science, and Race in World History. And the basic thing that one of the basic starting points is the case of 1640 John Punch, where an African American or an African was running away with two white indentured servants. They were all captured. The two white servants were given had years added to their contract. The Black person was given lifelong servitude. So this establishes the legal basis of enslavement in North America, because under British common law, there wasn't slavery actually. People were indentured servants, but there wasn't slavery per se. So racism and the system of the racial ideological system was created to divide and conquer poor people, Black and white people, and pit them against each other ultimately. And so independent Black politics includes instances of allies, white allies, in some ways working together with an understanding that their shared interest was greater than sort of the racial ideology that was really prying them apart, or pushing Black people apart from poor white people. So the Liberty Party was organized, and Frederick Douglass initially was actually critical of it, because he said, what's the sense? These are, basically parties of the slave owning classes. We're never going to defeat them. That is the Democrats and the Whigs. But he came to understand the importance of using the tactics of electoral politics as one tool to go after the slave system. And so it was that 1830s, 1840s organizers which create a lot of the models of organizing that we think of today. They had people part of speaking tours, they had boycotts, they had pamphlets, which also happened in the Revolutionary War time period, but this is sort of professionalized and it's done en masse. And they also did propaganda. And they had like tea sets that had the words of like the ABCs, but A would stand for abolitionism, B would stand for, whatever words that would tie to abolitionist themes. And so what happens is that by 1850, you have this Fugitive Slave Law, which basically makes it so that any Black person can be grabbed and taken into slavery, even if they're in the North. And so a coalition will emerge that will ultimately be called the Republican Party and included Black people that would challenge basically the dominant party of the slaveholding class, which is the Democratic Party. And then the outbreak of the war, and then ultimately the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. After the war is completed or is done, you have a new movement in the late 19th century called the Populist Movement, where you have African Americans, but also white people, and then at certain times they work together. That was defeated. In North Carolina has a particularly painful history around this because of the Wilmington Massacre in 1898 being basically the trigger to say, we will not, that is from the white supremacist vantage point, we will not tolerate this Black and white independent thing, and we are going to murder the people who've been elected. So it was a coup d'etat. It was an overthrowing of government, and that was in 1898 in Wilmington. And in here, Aycock, the governor, was instrumental in creating sort of the hysteria around the Wilmington riots. And so we're very close to some of this history. And unfortunately, we went through a process of renaming the Aycock Auditorium. And this is a process that's taken a long time. I mean, you recall that Gate City Boulevard was called Lee. It was named after Robert E. Lee. I mean, this history is very close to us here in Greensboro. So the 20th century would see more organizing. You see the rise of the Garveyites. You see sort of the Harlem Renaissance, and this is an area that Dr. Noel Morissette can speak about brilliantly. But in terms of the politics, there's artists and writers and other things that are trying to create sort of this independence of their own voices. And politically, this gets organized into various entities, whether it's the actually the Socialist Party, the Communist Party in the 1930s, and you have these also sort of radical Black independent groups that are formed, sort of all Black, inspired by Garveyism and others. And then you move into sort of the Black freedom struggle, which turns into the civil rights movement. And then you have sort of a number of organizations that will be formed, Black organizations. And the 60s will see the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act passed, which basically legally end Jim Crow. And in the period after that, you do see a number of Black elected officials via the Democratic Party. But in a very important national convention in Gary, Indiana, in 1972, African Americans came together, which is a tradition that goes back actually to the early 19th century, Black leadership coming together and say, okay, which way shall we go? And in 1972, basically, there was a fight about which way. From the vantage point of African Americans is, should we continue to vote and get Black people elected through the Democratic Party? Should we just form an all Black political party? Or should we create some kind of multiracial third party? And ultimately, which won out was sort of the view that just keep electing more Black people through the Democratic Party. Sort of the idea of creating an all Black party may have made sense in some places where you have majority Black populations, but as a nation, you get all Black people together, you still are, still a minority. And so and so, but there was a political power with sort of independent Black parties as well. So over the course of a number of decades, and I'm a progressive, I mean, I'm actually an independent, but I'm progressive in my thinking. The Democratic Party basically saw an enormous increase of people elected into office, but you also see a continued rise of poverty and violence in Black communities. And so, one could say, oh, now you could say the Republicans are to blame for this, but the Democrats also were in power when these things were happening. So it's a very deep structural issue, which others can speak to here. But the police came out of slave patrols. It's very part of a deep structural racism in America that the parties, in some ways, it's beyond the parties, if you will. So so in 1988, I mentioned Dr. Lenore Fulani, and I'll just wrap up here so we can open things up. In 1988, Dr. Fulani decided that she was going to run for president. In fact, she had been working on this in 1984. And Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jesse Jackson, who hails from here in Greensboro A&T University, was the nominee. He was a candidate in the primaries, but he was denied the nomination. And her campaign slogan in 1988 was "Two roads are better than one." Vote for Jesse, Reverend Jackson, in the primaries, but if he doesn't win, vote for me. And so she was trying to, in some ways, move the Black community, but also progressives in general, because her coalition was also multiracial, to not be so locked and tied to the Democratic Party. Now, I know we're in a particular election here where I think that it's, for me as an independent, I know who I'm voting for, and it's pretty clear what needs to be done. But I'm saying that we have to look at the larger history of the Democratic Party as an organization. And what she was saying, and I'm with her on this, and I actually worked for many years with her, as I was actually one of her aides, and I traveled the country like Dominic travels and talks to people. I did that with Dr. Fulani. It was such an honor. I learned so much. And we brought her actually here for the 30-year anniversary of our Black Studies program, which is AADS. And she came back a couple of years later for a talk that I did through the Honors College as well. But she said, like in any kind of relationship, even personal relation, for those of you, if you're in a personal relation, if you put all of your eggs in one basket, emotionally and otherwise, it's kind of a setup. That's why it's really important in life to have friends, because you might have a partner or whatever, but you might also want to spread and have other kinds of relations because it gives you perspective. And I think that a lot of abusive relationships come from people becoming overly dependent on one thing. And, in the history of America, one of the things, it gets gendered where, women were dependent on men for income among certain classes of people. And, part of the white feminist movement comes out of the fact that, women wanting to kind of be in the workforce and what that meant. So, there's a lot to break down here, but the point that Dr. Fulani was making was that, you want to not be, you don't want to be overly dependent on one organization, even if that organization's platform is progressive and what have you. And what she said is like, what has happened is that since 1972 is we've seen an increase of poverty. It seems like that strategy has not really worked very well for Black people. Yes, many Black people got into offices and there were social services that did benefit many people, but there's still intractable forms of poverty among Black communities. And so that was her concern, was that to create more options. And so independents, Black and white, but Black independents in particular, have been sort of that voice of saying we need to open up our process, not narrow it down. And so we're now in a situation where the American people voted for the first Black president, as in President Obama. They talked about Clinton being the first Black president. To me, that just doesn't make any sense. He was not a Black president. He's a white guy. He's a white guy, and his politic is not. Anyways, but President Obama is a Black person, and so he was elected. And but we are also a nation that voted in Donald Trump. It's very interesting, and so I engage this a little bit. The sort of that the same people that voted in one person like Obama voted in Trump, and that's part of who the American people are. And it's a very close election. And I do encourage everybody to go out and vote, because North Carolina is in play right now. It is literally neck and neck in the polls. So every vote will count. So let me stop here and let's open things up, and would love to hear what you're thinking, your thoughts, your comments, and I'll hand things over to Dominic to sort of moderate the conversation. So thank you.
So yeah, thank you, Dr. Ali, for that heartfelt question. I'm just going to kind of start off with a few questions, and of course, everyone else, you can just come in whenever. But I just, this is an important conversation to have, especially like how intense this political election is. I've never really, especially with the presence of social media, right? Really, kind of advocating and getting us more involved with COVID-19. So how do you see social media playing a role in getting people more proactive in the voting process, right? Because I know we have, even with COVID-19, these different methods of like, you can do an absentee vote and et cetera, et cetera. So what role do you think social media plays in our education towards this election and how we should be more involved politically?
Well, I think it's like everything else that we've created as human beings. It's a tool that we can use, and it's sort of a double, but it's also, it's a double-edged sword. I don't know if it's whatever. It's that it's a tool that has been used to mobilize, and it was certainly valuable in organizing Black Lives Matter. Social media enhanced and projected the voice of young people and people who wanted to support basically the outrage of Black bodies being brutalized by police officers and the criminal justice system. And so that's important, but I was actually thinking about what we were saying as we were coming on this call, which is sort of how there's something about not being in front of each other that can create a distancing, not just physical distancing, but we then become more polarized, because what ends up happening, and we know this through studies of Facebook and other things. I know that most people here probably don't do Facebook, but social media is that people tend to listen and gravitate towards their sort of echo chamber.
Yes.
And so, and also the algorithms that are part of Facebook and these other things actually enhance that. So there's misinformation, there's disinformation campaigns, there's all kinds of stuff like going on. But the most problematic thing is that people are in some ways structurally pushed to these different camps. In my organizing as a community organizer, I've always tried to in some way see what is it that's in what others are doing or saying that I can build with. I mean, I'm proud to say some of my good friends are people who are more socially conservative because they're actually really decent. And some of my more progressive friends talk the talk, but they actually don't do much. So in some ways, I much appreciate somebody who might talk more social conservative, but actually does a lot of stuff for the community, including like giving a lot of money. So I'll take that. And I think that language, we have a professor of English here, so I feel a little embarrassed talking about this, but I think, language, there's something about language. I gravitate towards ideas of this philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein, and thinking about language as also activity. Like we think that language is all about just the meaning of the words, but meanings only mean stuff in context and are relational. So for me, I've always thought of language as just, it's more about the activity of speaking and what we're doing between people than just the words meaning something that are often taken out of context, because it's like museums, a piece of art is completely taken out of context, social use. And so language sometimes, even in books, including my own, is taken out of its full context, the richness of its full context. So what I'm saying here is that social media is a tool and has been valuable and should be used as another tool, but it has also served to polarize and keep people thinking that their way is the only way. And so I think that it's what you do with it, like anything else. Like this pen I can use to write beautiful poetry. I can talk about, Dr. Morissette and Dominic, X's, brilliance as writers and poets, and I can write that stuff. Or I can take this pen and like poke them in the eye. So it's a tool. and we should think of social media as another tool, and everything it can be used for good or for ill. So that's how I think about it. I know that's a little bit strange response, but that is actually how I think about it. Yeah. Yeah. What other thoughts do you all have about some of the history that I was laying out?
For one thing, it was Toni Morrison who called Bill Clinton the first Black president.
Yeah.
It might be the one sentence she ever stated that I disagree with. But I think it's also telling. I mean, there was a Black artist at the time who did a portrait of Bill Clinton and made him like made his hair kinky and stuff. And I mean, the idea of a Black president seemed so far away, even then, right? Even with Shirley Chisholm, even with Dr. Fulani out there. And I feel like the struggle, one of the struggles, you're talking about social media polarizing folks, and it does, and it lacks contour, I think, like the contour of life for as
When you
many.
say contour, do you mean like nuance or the gray? Is that what you mean?
I guess I mean a more in-depth thought.
Okay.
Right. If you can only post an excerpt, I guess this is my thing. And then I struggle with this, and I discuss this a lot with my teenage son, because I think it's about meditating and learning and being kind of open to things that are not familiar, right? And I think, I'm horrified by all of these reactions to Black Lives Matter, right? Which is really, I mean, okay, a few things. The reaction of, I'm thinking about this in terms of images, so I'll just go with it. So the image of a white protester naked in the middle of a street. Have you seen that? She's sitting naked in the middle of a street with the policeman.
Oh, yes.
Her, right? Like it's so. What am I trying to say? That sometimes people are. Okay, what am I trying to say? That there's a way in which Black Lives Matter as a Black people's protest movement, right, is rendered, has its power taken away by mainstream people who think they're being helpful, but also by people who just don't want to hear what's being said, right? Assaulting protesters, pointing guns at protesters, right? All of that. And so I wonder, I think kind of understanding history and the complexity of how people do stuff, right, is really important, right? We do have complex alliances and stuff, but it also seems to me that with the two roads approach, there's that's a really kind of telling way to think of our prior leaders, right? Someone like a James Weldon Johnson or a Marcus Garvey, really. But also how to think about kind of the risks of stepping into institutions. I mean, you're mentioning, Omar, Barack Obama giving up his kind of base, network base. So it seems like networks are really critical, but to what extent can institutions and people who represent those majority institutions effectively participate in this advancement of Black rights? I know that's not really, it's a messy question, but I'm just kind of thinking about, if you're in power already, right? No one wants to, it's okay. Like Zora Neale Hurston would say, the game of keeping is not half so interesting as the game of giving up what one has, right?
Mhm.
Or getting what one doesn't have. Sorry, I've got that
Yeah.
wrong, right?
Yeah.
You know, so I
Well,
think there are a lot of painful conversations about giving up status and priority and finances and privilege and whatnot, giving it up, not using it. Does that make sense?
what do you mean? How do you make that distinction, giving up versus not?
Well, giving up in terms of, like, for example, a conversation about reparations, right? What would that entail? Giving up in terms of, you know, who gets to speak at a protest, right? Or make the ultimate, you know, kind of artistic statement at a protest by taking off all their clothes. I mean, you know, things like that. I'm wondering, it just seems like there's complexities to the two-road approach that we could talk about.
Yeah. What do others think about what Professor Morissette is saying, and what came to mind? Sounds like Dominic, you're ready to go with something.
No, I'm gonna let everyone else speak. I just
Yeah.
Well, to clarify, I guess my question is, are we discussing, is it, if as a Black person's protest, should we have Black people be the face and to control the narrative? Is that, and is, when there isn't a Black person who's at the forefront, does that mean that we're giving away some of the power? Is that we're discussing? Well, my opinion of that, I think that it becomes, I think there's allies, you know, in the fight, and that sometimes in order to speak someone else's language, you need someone they're familiar with. With that being said, that person has to understand that they are more of like a vessel so that the other person can understand, but they're not the center or the person who's most needing of the help, if that makes sense. So understanding the position of being an ally and what it means, I think becomes the most important to me, if that makes sense.
So who's speaking right now is Kalia, who is the
yeah,
program
sorry.
coordinator for AADS. Yeah.
Well, I had
go ahead, please, Michael.
I had a question.
Professor Cawthon is here.
Yes. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean when you say you're a progressive? Because, you know, we use that term a lot, but I think people have many different ideas about what that stands for.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I appreciate the question, because we sometimes use words and we might mean different things by them. And actually the opposite is true. We might use different words to mean the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is interesting. Language can be very misleading in that way. So I think for me as a progressive, I think that for me, it's this idea of a commitment towards radical inclusion of all peoples in terms of their own, creating their own destinies, if you will, and that it should be unmediated. I think that I don't like the idea of having to be mediated by other people. I think I don't know if it was, I think it was Noelle, you were saying about sort of like the voice of the protesters and the importance of Black voices in this case, being the ones that are creating the dominant narrative as opposed to just reacting is very important. So I think for me, it's this idea of how do you support the development of all people? To me, that's a progressive stance. How you get there is not, for me, by saying that there's only a special group of people who have this thing that you have to go through them. And so I don't mind messiness. I really don't. So that progressive also includes creating policies and structures that enhance that. So it's not just interpersonal, you know, being like encouraging of people, but it's also creating those structures. So I think that's a little bit of what I mean. Yeah.
I would have never thought that.
No?
No.
What did you think?
Yeah, so I think have had a very narrow idea about progressive in terms of listening to the political dialogue in terms of how it affects economic policies
Mm.
more than how it's affecting social engagement in equality and equity, socially and civilly, which seems like where you're focusing, as opposed to how we're going to use the government to help this help Americans be successful. So when I think of a liberal perspective versus a conservative, I think a liberal perspective is one where the government is saying that a liberal perspective where the government may say it can play a central role in the success of its citizens, whereas a conservative role might say, well, the government is actually in the way, getting in the way of the success of its citizens, and a progressive role being a more stringent version of the liberal version that maybe the government can actually be very instrumental in facilitating the success of its citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't seem that's not where the branch you're on, which is not good or bad. I'm just saying I didn't think you were going to say what you said.
Yeah. I don't actually. It's interesting because with regards to the divide of sort of the liberals and the conservatives, or this idea of left and right, which actually interestingly goes back to the French Revolution. It's where people sat relative to the president of the parliament, basically, of their equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who were on the right were basically those who believed in the ancien regime, that's the old traditions and keeping aspects of the church and property, versus those on the left aisle who believed in getting rid of property rights and having a more radical vision of the citizen, a secular society. And so we inherit this left-right sort of framing. But the actuality is that there's actually a lot of overlap in the practices of liberals and conservatives. And where I stand is, I mean, in terms of the framing that you offered, I think that there's some things, clearly there's things that I feel close to in terms of the liberal politic, but there's also aspects of conservatives that I think are actually good, like entrepreneurial spirit is a very good thing to encourage. But the problem is that it's like the banks don't loan money to people who actually need it to actually have the capital to start businesses.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the micro banking sort of movement, what is it, Granil or whatever in India, Bangladesh, was so important because it gave money to the poorest of people, which were women. So I think that there's aspects of we get to go back to this thing about social media. We get put into these categories that sometimes it's not really helpful, because actually there's things that others are doing that might be really helpful for certain situations. Like, I'll give you a concrete example around public education. One of the attacks that liberals have is on charter schools, because they say, well, because charter schools are taken over sometimes by religious entities, and they're taking away from the public schools and all that. And that's true on the one hand, but there's also public schools that are charter schools that actually use that money to do other things which are quite progressive. Actually, my kids are in a charter school that's pretty progressive, so I'm sort of biased. But I think it depends on what you're doing. The specificity of the project is important. So I think the problem is that we sort of poo-poo the other side, like, oh, that's what the liberals do, or that's what the conservatives. Actually, if we try to remove those categories and look at what is it that people are doing, we might be able to actually have some kind of rapprochement. I don't know, but I'm going to stop speaking because others probably have other things to say. Yeah, but thank you for that, Professor Coffin.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Any others?
Can you talk about, is there a tension? I promise this is a better question. So can you talk about, is there a tension between generations of Black activists at this moment in time? And
yes,
are there conversations or rapprochements that need to happen there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big dividing lines is that people who are an older generation, who are closer to the 1960s, have a certain kind of loyalty to the sort of the those who ultimately became Black elected officials off of the sort of their experiences in the civil rights movement, younger people don't have the same attachment to that generation. And I've seen this over the last 20 years. People are like, well, I mean, people love John Lewis, and but there's certain icons, but there's less of an attachment like to the Democratic Party because of it being sort of this thing that, civil rights, because it wasn't, again, the Democrats that led it. So many people who benefited and got elected in some ways did it through the Democratic Party. But there's definitely a divide because the youngest cohort of African Americans are definitely much more independent than the older cohort. And that's true across the board. Younger people are less tied to the political parties. A number of years ago, I did a statewide poll with 4 students, and we went to 16 campuses, public, private, women's colleges, HBCUs, community colleges as well. Independent, like basically looking for who are young people. And the report that we issued was basically, that there is a rising anti-partisan spirit in the air, that people are less into political parties as the older generation. And that's true. I think that, again, to go back to the Obama 2008, people were voting for him, not so much the Democratic Party, in many cases among the younger cohort, but it hasn't been decoupled in the way that it should be. So to answer the question, yes, the divide is between those who are more loyal to the civil rights era memory and politic, and those who are like, what has that done for us? I have $1 gazillion in student loan debts. My parents I'm never going to be able to make as much as my parents are. I'm still living at home because I don't have enough to have independence. So a lot of disappointment and frustration. And I think that's some of what I see, but many others can speak to this. I mean, what about, those of you who are on this call here? What do you think?
Shy people. Dominic, I saw you nodding your head. Tell us what you're thinking about this too.
Well, I'll speak to some of them because I don't know how old they are or where they're at. But I know that I was around their age when I first participated in voting, because when Barack Obama was running for his first term, I was too young to vote for him. I was still in high school, and so that second term was my first opportunity to actually get involved in the political process. And I'm gonna turn this actually to a 2-part question. Is when I first went to the ballot, right? And I'm not gonna list particular things or particular parties, but I saw that there were much more to the voting process than I thought, because I just thought the way the media kind of projects it, it's just like the president, right, and the vice president.
Yeah.
But then I looked at the ballot, and there's the state of secretary, right? Yeah. The commissioner of agriculture, the commissioner of insurance, the commissioner of labor, right? There's the court of appellates and chief justice, and it's all these different representatives running for different things. So can you talk to first the educational process of voting, right? Especially for young people, and especially them trying to be non-affiliated or they do associate with the party, how important it is to understand those other roles and how they actually impact the hierarchy of the president. And then my second question is, even not with this political election, right? Why is it important for us to start reading about or studying the other parties who are listed, like the Green Party or the Constitutional Party or the Liberation or the Libertarian Party, mm-hmm. which also have individuals that I thought were quite interesting and have views that I share. Like, for instance, I know Kamala Harris gets a lot of political attention because this is a potential, woman of color, Black woman running, as vice president. But then you have Angelina Walker, who's a part of the Green Party, which isn't really popular. And her views honestly probably align more with the views of young
what you people. Actually believe.
Yeah, we actually believe, like environmental justice for one thing. Yeah. And so, can you speak on those that's a 2-part question, but I'm pretty sure that's something that may interest, our age group a little bit.
Well, I'll speak to it briefly, and I'm also sensitive to time because it's I have 7:58 here. I don't know how long this is going to go. I'm assuming it's about an hour. Is that right, Noel? Yeah, okay. So I'll keep my response brief, but basically I think that you should all run for office as independents, because if we're going to have meaningful innovation in this country, we have to break out of this two-party sort of gridlock. The two parties actually lock arms when it comes to structural issues like getting on the ballot. It's not in the interest of either the Democratic or the Republican Party to have too many people running, because they want to control. If they could win elections with one vote, that's fine by them. I've been part of elections where literally 3% of people come out, like in the Bronx, and it's voting suppression benefits the two major parties. Independents are sort of like an unknown entity. So right now they're breaking for Biden, and Harris. But last election, independents overall broke for Trump, actually, because they saw him as sort of like somebody who could like stick it to the system. That's how they viewed him. They saw him as like sort of like, they were less guided by the xenophobia and sexist and all that stuff. It was more like, let's just use, it's like a very like, dull tool, but let's just use it to like stick it to the system. So independents have played that sort of volatile role. They'll go one way if they think that can like, and then another way. So I think that my response is that if run for office, we need your voices, and run as independents, because that will help to bust up this idea that you can only vote for this party or that party. And I think that there's a lot of people within the camp of the Republicans and within the Democrats, but I think there's still camps, and they keep us locked into a way of thinking in binary ways, which is not actually helpful in life to think in those ways. And you'll also learn stuff by running for office, like the challenges of literally just getting your name on the ballot, getting out. And you'll see that the two major parties, like when Dr. Fulani, I'll end with this. When Dr. Fulani, when she got on the ballot, it required her getting about 1.4 million signatures. The Democratic and Republican parties only had to gather about 50,000 each. And the reason was that because those who make the rules rule. So Democrats and Republicans wrote the rules to make it virtually impossible for anybody who's not a Democrat or Republican to get their name on the ballot. So when 1992, 4 years after Fulani got on the ballot in all 50 states, and she had to win 11 state lawsuits, okay, just to get her name on the ballot. 4 years later, when Ross Perot, little Texas billionaire with deep pockets, had $70 million personally to finance his campaign, which seems like a lot, but actually the Democrats and Republicans start off at that time with $50 million of taxpayer money each to start off their presidential campaigns. So 70 million is actually not that much, relatively speaking, but it was enough to just sort of to create this sort of stir in American politics. But when he tried to get on the ballot, who he went to, and this is what's important here, is he went to Fulani to find out, how did you do this? How did you get your name on the ballot in all 50 states? And she said, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of legal sort of, maneuvering. And so a little known Black woman from Chester, Pennsylvania helps to get this billionaire on the ballot because of the experience she had. And so there's something about the experience that is important. I think that she learned the limitations of the two major parties and the ways that they'll try to block outside voices, third parties included. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says you have to run with a political party. So learn off of that. I mean, Dominic, you're just such a natural leader. You should be running for office because people follow you, and you should just do it. And the thing is, exactly, people do that because they're like, no, it's too, it's like, But if we just let the people who want to get elected for other reasons get elected, things are going to change. And I think this is to Dr. Morisset's point, the issue of power is corrupting in that many of the people who got elected off of their legacies as civil rights organizers into the Democratic Party, Black and white, but mostly Black, we're talking about here, actually became more enamored with being in elected office than in actually serving the community. And so they used the legacy of the civil rights to get in office and then stay in office, rewriting rules to keep themselves in power. So term limits is a very important thing. People should not be in office for 20 years. That was not designed. Elected officials in the Republic actually were designed just to be in there through rotation of service and get in, do your service and get out. But now we have professional elected officials who were in office for 30 years. And so what I say is run and use that as one of the vehicles. Do what Frederick Douglass ultimately said, which is like, use it as another vehicle. Don't poo-poo it. Even though the Harvard School of Government, 80% of the respondents said that they did not want to go into electoral politics because that was not the place to make change. You could make it through nonprofit work or entrepreneurial stuff. But we don't want to also give up that, because that's part of what we have in the mix. So I say, if any of you decide to run for office, call me up and I can try to help you, because I know a lot of people and I've been doing this for some time. But that's what I would say in response to your question. Anyways, we are over the hour. All right. Well, any final thoughts or comments from this group?
Just thank you for your time and your expertise.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Professor Cawthon is always so gracious, and thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the little claps there. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Sophie's giving you claps.
Yeah, very nice. Well, thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Professor Moore, for helping this conversation, and I hope you do all get a chance to vote early if you can. Can I see just a sense of who here is voting early? Just either you can signal it. I'll just raise my hand if you're going to vote early. Yeah, try to vote early if you can, because it's going to be a big old fat mess come election day. So the earlier we do it, the better. And encourage others to do it. Now, a lot of people are like, well, it's not going to make a difference. North Carolina, it does make a difference. If you're in New York, because it's going to overwhelmingly go a certain way. But in North Carolina, it literally will make a difference. So really pull out your friends and family to do that. Okay. Well,
I would just add also, the history workshop on voting, history of voter suppression that happened a couple weeks ago reminded me that one of the effective ways of disenfranchising folks is by convincing them that their vote doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
It's actually a very effective technique. So
yeah.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you. I hope everybody has a good evening. Be safe, and I hope that you're able to get to the ballots and cast your vote. I see some folks have already voted, which is great. And thank you again for joining this conversation this evening. Have a good night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.